because we're about to go back to ancient Greece, and this may be an epic tale. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, so very far from my home. Circe was sitting on a rock singing that song. Euterpe had given it to her. I won't be giving it to any of the humans for millennia, but somehow it reminds me of you. No daughter born of a nymph has a mother, and Circe's had disappeared back into the ocean before her baby girl had taken her second breath, and without even bestowing the expected gifts of beauty and grace. And her father, Helios, he whose job it used to be to drive the chariot of the sun across the sky before Apollo had taken it over in preparation to giving it to his son, Phaeton. Well, he'd always been distant, but now he grew cold. She was a plain little demigoddess growing up on Mount Olympus. She had friends amongst the muses whose names were always a little vague and their numbers changed. And they were all so beautiful and graceful. The only thing like a family she ever had was Hermes. And it was he who had brought her to this island of Aeolia, lush, growing with many new and strange plants. He had said, Circe, you are the goddess of magic and sorcery, poisons and potions, and this is your domain. She got right to work, and her first sorceress project was her own image. No more that plain little demi-goddess from Mount Olympus. She took honey from the many bees on her island and whispered incantations over them and rubbed the honey into her skin until it was a dark mahogany brown, burnished to perfection. She took rosemary from the waves of it growing and put it through her hair till it turned dark black. And with the beeswax, she made curled ringlets that fell all the way down to her ankles. A few words and magic motions over belladonna that she touched to her eyes, and they were black as the midnight sky. She sang and stirred and drank and molded until at last she was irresistible to any mortal. And mortals did come to her island, whether their boats got lost or shipwrecked. They would come onto her beach, and she tried to give them things, but they would not worship her. Oh, sure, they desired her, but they would poach in her forests without asking. They would refuse to bow before the goddess that she had become. And so, as she grew more and more disenchanted with the mortals, she began to enchant them, transform them into wild animals, mountain wolves 5 feet tall who would obey her merest whim, bears that towered high and would roll over or play dead at her snap, the owls unusually large, that flew around her island, would share their sights with her, and then land docilely on her shoulder next to the lions and tigers who put their heads on her feet and in her lap. Nothing was left of their humanity, their minds or spirits, but Circe felt it was much better this way. Hermes came to her again and said, Circe, your heart has grown hard. It's not good. But what did she care for mortals? What was it Calliope had gifted her? Oh, what fools these mortals be. She was saving it for someone or another. But she said, Circe, you can use that in the meantime, and use it she did. Foolish mortals, foolish, foolish mortals. Soon they avoided her island all they could. And Hermes came back to her and said, be careful, Circe. There is one coming who will be under my protection. Your sorcery will have no effect on him, and he will have the power of life and death over you. Circe laughed. I simply don't believe you. I have grown so very powerful. But she was a little more cautious with the next few shipwrecks. Until one day she was in the middle of her island, working on a new sorceress project of growing a palace from laurel and olive trees, whose branches and leaves made the very walls. She called to the rocks to make steps that would be just the length of each one's stride who walked upon them. She had just put the crowning willow as a roof above her palace when one of her she-wolves howled, someone comes. His name is Odysseus. Circe took out her scrying bowl and looked into the water. Odysseus, yes, she had heard of this one. Ah, he was the one who had helped to win the war at Troy. It was his idea to build that fateful wooden horse. But it's been 10 years since then. Ah, adventure after adventure. Let him come. But as she watched, his sailors, all his men, they poached in her forest. They spit and were vulgar and had no thanks for the goddess of the island. I will prepare for them, she said. She took the devil's trumpet and the poppy and their juices and blended them to add to her finest wine, and laid out a banquet with golden cups and crystal plates. And they came. The thunderous horde of sailors came up the path and fell on her feast without even stopping. And they saw her, and they were swine. So as they drank the poppy and datura laced wine and fell to the floor, she raised her willow wand and said, you shall be swine in form. Their hands and feet became hard hooves, and on one end of each sailor was a twisty tail, and on the other a snout. They snorted and snuffled, and Circe laughed. And then she saw him, the one sailor who had not fallen on her feast, and off he ran to tell his captain what had befallen the men. Let Odysseus come, she herded the swine into a large pig pen. She waved her wand and cleared the banquet room and set a table with just 2 places. And the goblets that she made, she filled again with laced wine and doubled the dose and waited for Odysseus to appear. Less of an animal than his men, he nodded to her when he arrived. He sat down and ate, and at last, when she handed him the goblet, he drank. But he did not fall at her feet. Don't you know who I am, witch? I am under the protection of Hermes. He said, as long as I keep this white flower close to my chest, your enchantments will have no effect on me. And with that, he took his large sword and swung it above her head. Give me back my men. And in that moment, Circe's heart cracked open again. She felt the fear of death, but something more with this mortal. You can kill me. Hermes told me you had the power, but if you spare my life, I will change your men back, and I will never harm another mortal as long as they come to me. All right? It's a deal, said Odysseus, putting his sword back to his waist. And Circe was as good as her word. She changed his men back into sailors who were younger and stronger and somewhat more well behaved than they had been before, and certainly more beautiful. And Odysseus and his men enjoyed her hospitality on her island for a year and a day, until at last their boat was put back together. And Circe gave them a warm west wind to blow them back to Ithaca. And after that, when people washed ashore, they found their wounds healed. They found their hearts comforted. And if they happened to be without family, they'd stay on the island, and they would swear that Circe had such great compassion. She must truly be a goddess who knows what it's like to be a motherless child, far from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, so very far from my home. Thank you all for listening.